One of the lesser-known names of the civil rights movement in the 1960s was a white Methodist pastor from Nashville named Reverend Sam Dodson. He was the leader of a very quiet, very traditional community. But something happened to him. He heard in the news about the segregation that was going on at lunch counters in Nashville in those years, and it bothered him. And when he would read the gospel, he felt that it was clear that this was not God's will. So he felt called to go and participate in the famous sit-ins that were happening at the lunch counters in that era. And because he did, he was arrested several times for that. He also felt called to march with people about civil rights issues at times. And he had been arrested several times for that work too. And on more than one occasion, he had been beaten by a counter-demonstration mob that was there protesting the civil rights. So when he finished all that business and got to the other side of his activism, he wound up living a very quiet rest of his life. He died just a few years ago at an old age. At his funeral, a lot of people were saying, oh, Reverend Dodson was ahead of his time. And his granddaughter spoke up and said, he wasn't ahead of his time. He was in his time. He faced a reality and responded to it the best he could. And that's exactly what we're all called to do, she said. He was not ahead of his time. He was responding to the call of his time. And that is what the gospel is telling us today, too. We do not need to be ahead of our time. It is enough to be awake to what we're living in right now. We're called to be in our times, not ahead of our times. And St. Paul in the second reading says the same thing. Stay awake. The time is obviously closer than we thought. We're obviously coming to a tipping point, so stay awake. You don't know at what hour the Lord will call your name. Now, if you're like me, this can sound scary. But there is a spiritual truth that can help us to stay calm in the midst of all this. And that is that we were made for the times in which we live. We were made for these times. God could have chosen to have us be born anywhere, any place, anytime. We could have been born as cavemen and women. We could have been born during the Renaissance. We could have been born 500 years or 1,000 years in the future. But we weren't, because God doesn't need us to be alive then. God wants us here, right now. We were made for these times. And the example they give of how important it is to stay awake is such a good one. It's the people of Noah's time. They say, do you realize that in the time of Noah, there were people the day before the flood that were planning their spring vacation? Foolish. Only a few people knew we need to stay alert. There's a flood coming. So while Noah was building an ark, other people were making plans for vacations that were never going to happen. And we are being called to stay awake in that same way. Because as I look at the faces in this assembly today, I see people who have faced floodwaters in their own lives. There are people sitting here right now who are in the midst of cleaning up from a flood. So, how can we stay awake so that we can be prepared for whatever could happen in our lives? The fact that we are all here today means that everybody here is what we call a practicing Catholic, which is a term I just love. A practicing Catholic. Isn't that interesting? No matter what religious denomination we're talking about, if the people participate in it, we call them practicing, which is such an interesting term. Sometimes I'll be in a situation or a party somewhere, and I'll end up being in a conversation with someone, and I'll say to them, so are you Catholic? And they'll say, well, I was raised Catholic, but I don't practice. Which always strikes me as a funny thing to say. I was raised Catholic, but I don't practice. It makes me want to say back, so how do you think you're going to do in the playoffs? Imagine a soccer player saying, oh yeah, I play soccer, but I don't practice. Good luck with the postseason. It's going to be a little rough. That's why this term is so appropriate. Practicing. We are called to be practicing Catholics. So then the question comes for us, is showing up weekly enough? Is that enough practice for you? Will that prepare you? Does coming prepare you? Because I would say maybe it's a start, but any coach can tell you having the team there for practice is just the beginning. How we show up, the amount of intention and commitment we put into showing up feels really important for us to be making this a decent practice, a practice that can actually help us. The way that we know that we're practicing and that it's working is if week by week we are incrementally better prepared for the floods that come into our lives. Bit by bit, week by week, incrementally better prepared. Because this is where we get our instructions. This is where they come from. There was a famous author, Joseph Campbell, who was a scholar and an expert on heroes and heroines. He wrote all sorts of books about heroes and heroines in literature and all the way up to superheroes. And what he said is true for all of those heroes is that a hero never knows what battle they're going to have to fight ahead of time. A hero never knows that. In his words, you never know what dragon you're going to have to slay. The hero simply is disciplined and ready for whatever's going to happen. And then, when the challenge comes, they summon their courage and they face it. So this week, we are being called to be the heroes of our own lives, to be the hero of our story. How are we going to use the faith that we practice to make us the hero of the story? 4 weeks from right now, it will be Christmas. So a great question for us is, how could I be more prepared for life in these 4 weeks than I was last week? How can I be incrementally better prepared for Christmas and then all that comes beyond it? And the answer might be different for everyone. Maybe for you it is to read the readings these next 4 weeks before you come to Mass. To look online or in a booklet that you might have and to read those readings and prepare your own homily so that when you come and hear what's being said here at church, it coincides with where you're thinking about the readings, that you're engaged with them. Maybe it's to do the 3 C's. Do you remember that? Some people started that last year. It's to set your alarm 5 minutes earlier and sip your coffee in front of a lit candle. The 3 C's, coffee, candle, Christ. Maybe that's what you're called to do. But whatever it is, wouldn't it be great if we did something that helped us to remember that we were born for these times? So that when we turn on the news and we feel overwhelmed and we don't even want to crawl out of bed and face it all, we can remember that we were made for these times, that we are God's answer to the situations that we face. I mean, that's our job. We're practicing Christians, and we're practicing for a championship. The great relief that we all have is that we do not need to worry about being ahead of our time. You can let that go. It is enough to simply be part of the times in which we live. And the way that we can feel relaxed and ready is to remember that it was God's choice that we're here. We were made for these times.